the Fight Numbers Podcast with your host, John Kelly.
What is going on, everyone? John Kelly here with FightNumbers.com, here for a special MMA DFS strategy show. Super excited. Going to talk a few things with you guys, but I felt like I needed to do this for a few reasons. One, I wanted to put out more evergreen content because a lot of the stuff that I'm doing on Twitch and YouTube is good for a slate or maybe a week or two, and then it's pretty much gone because every slate is different, right? So I wanted to make some more long-term content. I think this is a good way to start. For those that don't know, I actually did a more condensed version of this on the Pat James Ride In DFS podcast. I will link that in the description below. Be sure to check that out as well and subscribe to his podcast. He brings on a lot of really good guests, and I should be hopefully linking up with him again in the future to talk UFC stuff. So make sure you subscribe. Don't want to miss that. But today we're just basically the goal of this video is to take a person that's never played before or maybe has dipped their toes a little bit, but not one of the more experienced players, and basically take them from square one to turning them into being a successful player, or at least a lot more successful than they were previously. So I think there's a lot of good information and valuable resources that I'm going to share throughout this video. So I hope you guys get some type of value from it. But basically, we're going to start with square one. So if you already know how DraftKings scored, go ahead and if you're viewing this on YouTube, you can go ahead and skip a couple minutes. I'm just going to run through the way fights are scored before we really get started because it is important. So for those that don't know, DraftKings scores. Fighters accumulate points in a couple different categories. So the basics of the scoring is significant strikes, which are a stat tracked by Fight Metric. So however many significant strikes landed by that fighter, each significant strike is half of a DraftKings point. So if they land 100 significant strikes, they're scoring 50 off of their significant strikes alone. And then obviously if they win, they'll get a win bonus, whatever. But we know just based on the significant strikes, 0.5 DraftKings points for each one landed. For takedowns, if your guy lands a takedown, that's 5 DraftKings points. So we obviously right off the bat know that active high-volume wrestlers usually score pretty well. Advances on the mat, 3 points. Reversals or sweeps are 5 points as well. They're a lot less common than a takedown, but it still does happen. And then a knockdown. The illustrious knockdown is 10 points on DraftKings. So obviously it's one of the bigger things. If your guy can score a knockdown or sometimes multiple knockdowns, then it's just like a total print fest. Multiple knockdowns and a first round knockout, because then you get the win bonus too. So all of those are the individual ways to get points, but then you also have the win bonuses. So every fight is 3 rounds unless it's a title fight or the main event, then it's 5 rounds. So on a 3-round fight, if it goes all 3 rounds and goes to decision, the winner will get a 30-point win bonus. If you get a finish in the 3rd round, it's a 45-point win bonus. A finish in the 2nd round, a 70-point win bonus. And a first-round finish, a 90-point bonus. So obviously, right off the bat, you can see that not only do we like high-volume fighters, but we like fighters that could get a finish or should get a finish, and especially if it comes in the 1st round. So that's usually where you're going to get most of your points off of the early finishes, because on most slates, and every slate is different, but on most slates, you generally need about 100 points or so from all 6 of your fighters. And obviously every slate's different, like I said, but there are going to be many slates where you need about 100 points. And that's how you're going to do it, is usually with those early finishes. So now that we know how the fights are scored, I want to talk about a couple things, because it's one thing knowing how they're scored, but okay, so you say, John, we know we want this style of fighter, this active, high-paced fighter, but if you're new to UFC and you don't know who the fighters are or how they fight, you're not going to know who fits that mold, right? So one way that we can do that is I actually just released a stat last week, fantasy points per minute. And this is available for every single fighter in the UFC across all weight divisions. This is something that is not available anywhere else. It wasn't available because the UFC doesn't have many stats. So basically, I took what stats the UFC does provide and I turned it into a DFS stat in fantasy points per minute. And if you've played other sports, you know what that is and how important that is. So basically, why it's such a big deal, and I'm like pounding the table on this, is because fantasy points per minute is going to give you your baseline projection for these fighters. So it'll basically tell you who fights at a high pace. You know, we talked about the way these fights are scored. Well, if you don't know which fighters have that pace, then it doesn't help you. So this is a way to do that. This gives you a bigger picture, because if you see a guy that's averaging 4 fantasy points per minute, well, then you know on average he's scoring 4 fantasy points a minute times 15 minutes, 60 points right there. And then if he wins, another 30-point win bonus. So on average, that guy is scoring 90 points in a decision win, which is very good for a decision. So that's why this is so important. And 4 is really high. You know, you'll see other guys, and where it gets interesting is like you may see a guy that has decent odds to finish and he's projecting to be pretty popular on a slate. And then you look, and fantasy points per minute, he only lands 1.5. So that could be a situation where you get extra leverage against the field, because while he might have good odds to finish, which we'll get into the odds part later, if he lands a low fantasy points per minute and you take a high variance approach where if he doesn't get that early finish, then he's probably busting pretty hard and you're going to leap the field because he's so owned. So that there's so many ways that this stat can be valuable and is valuable. Like I said, it's live on fightnumbers.com right now. You can go check that out for sure. But that's one resource that I think you should be using when it comes to projecting fighters and building lineups. And then the other big portion that goes into it is Vegas odds, obviously. So if you play other sports, you know how important the Vegas lines are, but it's specifically, in my opinion, very important, if not the most important when it comes to MMA, because it's really how people get majority of their information. Like, a lot of people just look at odds and that's how they build lineups, or a lot of people just look at inside the distance odds and you know that's where the ownership's going to go. So it's not just about seeing who's a favorite and how big their favorite is and seeing where the money's moving, but by looking at these odds, you're going to find, you know, you're going to figure out where the ownership's going. So basically what I do, I'll go ahead and pull it up on fight numbers, on best fight odds. So this is what I use, best fight odds. Basically, I use this to, and these lineups we'll get into a little bit later, but so basically best fight odds has like 8 sports books that they have, and they have all the odds for every single matchup, and then they also have the props for each fight. So not only do we have the lines, but if you open, you could see where the money's moving in each matchup, which is very important, especially on a Saturday, midday Saturday or something like that. You want to see where the late money's going. The props aren't released yet for the May 30th card, but usually if you click this, it'll show all the props available. You see fight doesn't go to decision minus 150. So this is a very important stat. Even if you don't know anything about UFC, you can look at this, and this tells you, okay, that has a decent chance to finish, which means the winner's probably going to score decent. You know, let's find a different one here. The heavyweight one, Augusto Sakai. That one's actually not that good, but let's see. No, a lot of these aren't decent odds to finish, so I guess this isn't a good card to show that. But okay, here we go. The Billy Quarantillo versus Spike Carlisle, which is a fight I'm interested in for sure, but minus 175. So you know it has a pretty good shot to end in a finish. So just by doing that alone, you're already identifying fights that should score well, or at least according to Vegas should score well. And so that's one thing that I think is really important. And then when the rest of the props get released, you can see the inside distance lines, which anytime in my article, when I reference it, it's ITD, inside the distance. That's what that stands for, in case you didn't know. And all that means is, and I can't show you because it's not released, but all it is it would show Gilbert Burns inside the distance, and it would have a prop for him, a line for him, and you can see, what it opened at, where it's moved to, and all that's telling you is how likely the market thinks he is to finish inside the distance. So it's a very important stat to use and data point to use when you're building lineups and doing your research for MMA. So basically, you're using this as a data point to help you know what fights score well, but you're also using it as a point to be able to, obviously, for example, this card, there's only a couple of these right now that are the favorite to end inside the distance. So we know right off the bat that those are a couple fights that everybody's gonna flock to it, right? Because they're favored to end inside the distance and everybody wants a finish. So where it gets interesting is now we can project where the ownership is coming in. And that's where the other part of the Vegas odds are important, is we can get a really nice feel for where the ownership's going and why it's so important in a sport like this. I mean, it's important in every sport, but specifically MMA is because it's super, super high variance. You can be the best fighter in the world and be a 8-1 favorite, and you can still get knocked out and lose. Believe it or not, it does happen. So, and that's an extreme example, but it happens all the time as like a 3-1, 4-1 favorite. Those guys still lose sometimes, and it's a super high variance sport where you're only picking 6 guys. So if every single guy is going to be 30%, 40%, and the real popular ones 60 in some of the higher stakes, smaller field tournaments, 60, 70%. Tony Ferguson, I think, was 70% in the 153 max. So when a guy is that heavily owned, you're going to get massive leverage by taking the underdog, the other side of that fight. And why the odds are important is because if you see Tony Ferguson had great inside the distance odds on that card, so everyone flocked to him, especially in the higher stakes. So it's a data point to use as leverage against the field, especially if you have a strong take that maybe the field's higher on that person than you think based on the research that you've done. And those situations do come. It's not super often because a lot of the time the people who are the chalk are usually the on paper best plays. But again, it's such a high variance sport that literally anything can happen. And while we try to project what's the most likely outcome, sometimes stuff just happens and that you're unable to predict. Like the Michael Johnson fight, in my breakdown, I literally said he's way faster on the feet. He's going to beat him up on the feet, and he has good takedown defense. So I think he's going to stuff the takedowns and beat him up on the feet for 15 minutes. And that's exactly what happened through the first 5 minutes or so. And then Moises didn't even land a takedown. Johnson stuffed the takedown, but then he went right into and he got a heel hooked like immediately, and that he didn't even land a takedown. So even though my analysis was right, it's still such a high variance sport that literally anything can happen. And I bring that up because it's just a really good example that even when you're right, sometimes you're wrong, and that's why it's super important in terms of ownership. There are so many times where you can make a wrong play and it ends up being right, because if that guy is 10% because he's such a terrible play and the other side is 50%, when Greg Hardy's 50% and everybody thinks he's going to get a first round finish and he goes to a decision or whatever, then it's such a way to lap like 3/4 of the field if the ownership's that concentrated. And obviously, like in NFL and stuff, it's important as well. But if you get a guy at 3% versus getting him at 10%, it's not like night and day different. Whereas in MMA, it is night and day difference, because if you have that 10% guy that nobody else has and 60% of the field just took an L on that fight, you'd be surprised how quickly you can jump over people in large field tournaments. So that's why I wanted to harp on ownership as well. So just by using the Vegas odds, not just for your reference to build lineups, but also to project where ownership's going. And you don't have to actually sit there and like, oh, well, I think this person's going to be 18%, 15%, whatever. But at least familiarize yourself when you're building your lineups. Like, oh, I saw this fight had good inside the distance odds. I bet this guy's going to be the chalk. Stuff like that. Just at least have a decent feel for it. And I do ownership projections as well on Fight Numbers, and it's totally free, so you can check that out as well if you don't want to actually crunch the numbers, and that'll give you a good starting point at least. So basically, aside from just using fantasy points per minute or significant strikes and these stats and Vegas odds, also a lot of MMA research is subjective, and that's where it gets a little bit sticky. I do a tape study on pretty much every fight for every card. Anyone can do that. UFC Fight Pass, it's like $5 a month. You can get pretty much not every fight, because some of it is blacked out, but you can get a lot of the fights that you want to research. So that's where it gets a little bit sticky. So that part is subjective, but at the end of the day, you don't really have to use that if you don't want to. And really tying all of that stuff in together is what I do, and then basically try to predict the most likely outcome. And how I tie that all together when I'm building my lineups is based on all of that stuff and research and tape study and stats and everything. Based on all of that for each card, I try to identify a core of fighters each week. And it's usually about 3. Sometimes it's more if I'm really confident. Sometimes it might be less. It might be 2. But I try to target 3 fighters that I'm generally pretty confident on for each card. And this is where we're going to get into the actual lineup building process. And basically, so what I do is, using all of that information that we just talked about, I identify a core of 3 fighters usually that I'm confident in. So like, for example, this lineup here to my left, your left, my right, something like that. Amanda Nunes card. So this was, I think, in December. Amanda Nunes was part of my core. Soriano, and I wanted to bring this up because Soriano, it's usually pretty rare that I'm all in on somebody, but there are very rare cases, and I'll get to this in a few minutes, but he was one of those cases, so I wanted to point him out. So Amanda Nunes, Soriano, and I think Covington was the third guy in my core. So Usman ended up being on the winning lineup, but majority of my builds had Nunes, Soriano, and Colby Covington. And so basically, for that December card, that was my core. And what I do from there is, using all the other data and stuff that we just talked about, I've already identified other fights that I think the winner will score well. And while I might have a lean on who I think is going to win, because it's a high variance sport, I'm always going to be targeting both sides of fights that I think can score well. And what I mean by that is, so for example, the Colby Covington Kamaru Usman fight, obviously, I was heavy on Colby Covington. He was super cheap on DraftKings. I thought he was going to win. It ended up being a great fight. Kamaru Usman obviously won, and they both smashed in terms of scoring. But out of 20, 25 lineups, I probably had 15 Colby, 10 Usman, or like 17 Colby, 8 Usman, something like that, And even though I was confident in Colby, I still had enough of Usman to where if Usman won, my night wasn't over, and I still had live bullets. So that's really what I'm trying to do every single week, and that's why I really recommend multi-entry in MMA. I have a lot of people that ask, like, oh, I only play one lineup. Is this a good one? Yeah, it looks good, but if you're not playing, I would say at least like 5 lineups, it's very, very difficult, because again, it's such a high variance sport that you're almost never going to nail not only 6 winners on the card, but 6 winners that score 100 points or so on just one lineup. It's almost never going to happen. And it's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult. And in a sport like this where you need the nuts, especially in the bigger field tournaments, It's just, I highly recommend. I would say if you can't afford it, then drop down and play the smaller stuffs, and just so you can get about 10 lineups or so where you can target both sides. Whether it's the main event or not doesn't really matter. Chase Hooper, Daniel Tamer, that fight, I predicted Tamer was going to win. So I was wrong on that. And even though I was wrong on two of these fights, on the Usman Covington and Chase Hooper Tamer fight, where I had more Tamer than Hooper and I had more Colby than Usman, I still ended up chopping the $44 tournament because I didn't go all in on those guys. And that's why it's so important where you want both sides of each matchup. So say I put 12 lineups in the 44, I probably had 6 Tamer and 2 Hooper and faded on the rest. So even though my guy didn't win, I still had bullets and he was still mixed around my core. So that's why it's important. If you identify the right core, the goal is then to identify the right fights that score well and have at least some of both sides, so that obviously you want your guy to win, but if he doesn't, then you're not dead. Because if you go all in, especially in MMA, and your guy gets sparked in the first minute of a fight, you're going to have a really hard time even watching the rest of the card because you're going to be so angry that you have no shot at winning anything. So that's why I always recommend to people play multiple lineups and use that strategy, because you're never, even though I'm confident in my analysis and my research, I know that I'm never going to be right 100 times out of 100. I'm not going to go 13 out of 13 with all winners every single week. It's just not going to happen. It's just basic math. So how I attack that is, yes, I still make a stance on the players that I like and the fighters that I think will win, but I also want to be live, or at least have a shot to be live if my guys don't win. And that's why I wanted to bring these lineups up and sort of go over them, because like I said, Usman, I was wrong about, and he was 47%. That could have killed me if I was all in on Colby, and Usman scored 147, broke the slate. If I didn't have him, I probably would have lost so much money. And same thing with Chase Hooper. I didn't think Chase Hooper was that good. He was a punching bag in his debut, or on Dana White Contender Series. I just didn't think he was that good, and he comes out and gets a huge finish in the first round. So it's just a couple examples of why it's important to not only have the right core of fighters, but also leave yourself out if your pick per se is wrong. And there's been multiple times where that happened. And so that's why I wanted to bring that up, is because if you're implementing this strategy and doing it the right way, you can win even if you're not right. And I think that's really important. So that's why I wanted to harp on it so much. But also the other part of that I wanted to talk about was, even if there's a person that I'm just super confident in, Amanda Nunes, it's very, very rare that I'll go 100% on any slate. And the reason why is because, like I said, it's probably the highest variance sport there is. Because you could be the greatest fighter ever, and you could still go out there and get knocked out immediately. It happens. And so why I usually, it's very, very rare that I'll do that. Maybe I won't target any of the underdog if I don't think they have a shot at winning, but I still probably won't go 100%, especially if they're above 9K, just because it's so hard to pay off that value every single time. Not that they can't, but just going on 100% of lineups is, you're really putting all your eggs in one basket. And why I brought up Soriano was because that was actually a rare situation where I did go 100%. I think he was like 7,700. I don't think it tells me on, it doesn't tell me on here, but he was coming off Dana White Contender Series, had a matchup against, I think, Oscar Pichota, and I heavily favored Soriano. He was an underdog. He was cheap. I knew he wasn't going to be super owned because people didn't know him coming off Contender Series. So that was a very rare situation where I did go 100%. But it really just comes down to how much risk you're willing to take, because obviously that situation worked. I had 100% of a guy that was a lock for the optimal under 8K and scored 134, but it goes both ways. If you go all in and he gets kneed to the face and gets dropped immediately, then I already know I have no shot at winning. maybe you can min cash, but you have no shot at hitting the optimal because you went all in on one fighter and he got beat. So that's why people always ask me, like, what's the highest? Would you play this guy in every lineup? Almost every single time the answer is no. There are rare situations where I will, but majority of the time I'm targeting both sides at least a little bit, even if it's just a sprinkle. Or I'm just, maybe I have 60% of one side and 0% of the other, but I'm usually not 100%. It's super rare when that happens. But yeah, so that's basically it. Hopefully I explained that pretty well about how I use my strategy. So basically the gist of it is identify the right core based on all the data points and research that we talked about earlier in the video. And once you identify your core, you're mix and matching other fights that you think the winner will score well. And you're doing that with targeting both sides. And even if you have a lean on one side, you can still mix, Max Holloway and Volkanovski. You can mix them around your core and have 7 Holloway, 3 Volkanovski, and at least if you're right that the fight will score well and you're right about your core, then you're at least gonna have some live bullets. And that's really what it comes down to, is just having a shot by the time you get to the main event, having a shot at the optimal. And then at that point, you just want variance to go your way. And even if it doesn't, which there's been plenty of times where it doesn't, where literally you get to the main event, you have 5 of the 6 that are currently the optimal lineup, and all you need is a finish, or all you need is a win, and it just doesn't happen. That happens so many times with this, but majority, over the long term, it's eventually going to go your way. I promise that. As long as you're implementing the right strategy and putting in the work, the results are definitely going to follow. So hopefully I explained that pretty well. The last thing that I wanted to talk about in regards to MMA DFS is, so now we talked about the scoring and how we can leverage that. We talked about the data points that sort of go into my process. We've talked about my lineup building strategy, identifying a core and building fighters around that core, basically. And the last thing I want to talk about is contest selection. And this is big. And this is another reason why I put these lineups on here, is because contest selection is so huge. It's huge in every sport. Everybody knows that. In MMA, it's big because if you just play the main tournament, it's usually like a $10 or $15, sometimes $20. The Millie Maker June 6th is $25. If you just play that tournament with like 100,000 people in it or whatever, you literally have to have these stone nuts, the perfect lineup, in order to win it or win any significant amount of money in that tournament. So why that's important is because if you play some of the other tournaments, whether they're smaller prize pools, higher entry, lower field, whatever, you still have a shot to win even without the perfect lineup. And so I've actually had a lot of my success last year came with just playing the $44, which is usually either a 9 max or a 12 max. Sometimes it differs on the slate, but I would put 10 or 12 entries into that, and I would just focus on that and play that tournament. And why I did a lot better in that tournament is because there were times where I didn't have the nuts, but because nobody had the nuts, because the field was only 300 people, you still had a chance to win. So that's why I wanted to bring that up, is because sometimes you may have more success not chasing the big, huge prize pool because there's so much people in it. You have more shot of winning if you play some of the other tournaments. And I know it's not as fun because you don't have like the 25K win, the 50K win, and nowadays 100K to first place, which is insane. But you're more profitable over the long term. It's totally up to you, whether you can afford that and deal with those swings, because you're going to have slates where you don't return anything. If your core is wrong and you're not cashing anything, you're not going to win any money. So, but I did want to bring that up because, why it's important. Last year, like I said, I focused on the 44. I didn't play a lot in the main because I realized you needed the stone nuts. And most of the time I'm not hitting the stone nuts. Like I'm a realist. And why I bring that up is because there were multiple slates where I left a lot of money on the table. So this December one, that one would have tied for first in the main. So I think they chopped it like 10 ways. It was 30K or something like that. This one, yeah, this middle one, the Glover Teixeira, Carl Roberson fight, that one was the nuts for that slate. So that one would have chopped first place in the main tournament, and I didn't play it. And then the third one, that wasn't the nuts. So that was the other. That's why I put these three on there. It was the other side of it, was the 618 score. That's usually not going to be enough to take down a big tournament, and it wasn't enough for the main. It would have won me like $80 in the main, but in the 44, it was good enough for first place. And that's why I talk about contest selection. But on the flip side, these other two times, I didn't enter those lineups in the main. So I actually left thousands of dollars on the table by not just putting in a little bit more money to duplicate every lineup I built in the main tournament. Because even though, like I said, you're probably not going to hit the nuts all the time or ever, but at least give yourself the chance, if you are playing, to enter as many. If you make 10 lineups and you enter them in the 44 or the main, enter them in the $3, enter them in whatever, so that you give yourself a shot when you do have the nuts where you're winning multiple tournaments instead of just that one. So that's why I wanted to bring that up. And then the other reason why I had that December one on there is because you're going to see a lot of overlap. And that's why another reason why contest selection is important, because yeah, there might be 100K to first place, but if you're splitting it with 50 people, it doesn't look much better than taking a solo first place in the 44 or the 55 or whatever tournaments they're running. So that's why I wanted to talk about contest selection for a little bit and show you guys those lineups, why it could be sometimes valuable to look outside the box. If you usually only play like the $3 20 max or something like that, maybe duplicate half of those lineups and put it in the main tournament, and vice versa, just to give yourself more shots that if you do hit the nuts, you at least have it in multiple spots. So it's a bigger win for you, because like I said, I left a bunch of money on the table. It wasn't fun looking at my lineup that would have taken down the main by myself or whatever on a slate, and I didn't play it because I just didn't play it. So that's why I wanted to talk about contest selection as well. It's definitely important. But basically, that's it, guys. So we talked about the way DraftKings scores fights. We talked about how to leverage that to our advantage using fantasy points per minute, using the Vegas odds to be able to know not only what fights should score well according to Vegas, but what fights are going to be popular because people see the inside the distance, the odds, and how we can leverage that in a sport like MMA, where it is such a high variance sport, and sometimes the impossible does happen. You want to have one of those bullets where you're the guy at the top of the leaderboard, where they're like, oh my God, this guy played this dude. He's terrible. What a terrible play. And people are talking smack about your lineup. But really it's because you identified that this was going to be an ultimate leverage play, and you were willing to take a shot, even though you thought more than likely you're burning that lineup, but it's just that one time where it did come through and it was mixed around your core, and your core did hit and you won all the money. So basically we talked about all those things. Hopefully it helped, guys. Let me know in the comments. I definitely appreciate you guys joining us. I'll be back next week, back to normal schedule next week. We have a May 30th card, so I'll be breaking down the fights on Wednesday at 8 per usual. On a normal fight week, that's what I do, is Wednesday night at 8. Break down the fights and then upload to YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, everything like that. And I definitely appreciate all the feedback I've gotten the last couple of weeks. You guys have been awesome sharing my content, giving me shout outs, everything like that. I can't appreciate it enough. And I did want to highlight that we hit our goal of 50 plus Twitch followers. So I'm super grateful for that as well. We'll be doing a giveaway, some sort of giveaway next week for that. And our next goal, I wanted to put it down on paper or on video and say that our next goal is 100 YouTube subscribers. So it is a bigger goal because we're only at like 44 right now, but I think we can do it. It's totally free. I appreciate it, guys. I'll catch you next time. Until then, good luck.
You've been listening to the Fight Numbers Podcast with John Kelly. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like and subscribe.